Hello, you wonderful people, and welcome to another episode of Super-Fanta-Fi. This being a show where I talk about TV shows of the supernatural, fantasy, and or science fictional genre. For today's episode, I'm going to talk about the latest episode of the Winchesters. A lot of really interesting things went down in this episode, so let's break it down. Well, first and foremost, it seems like the monster they were dealing with initially in this episode seemed to be a djinn, but because the fact is, you could tell something was off with Ada, like something with this struck a chord with her the moment she saw like how the councilman died and what that was all about. Because obviously Carlos is like, him and Lotta were more like, hey, we need to focus on the Akrita. That's kind of our bigger issue, especially considering we know that they have like some human cohort to some extent that's kind of leading them. But Mary and John are like, no, like hunting this case could be the connective tissue that we need to go down. And Ada was like, she sided with them, but it's because looking at the newspapers, like it meant something to her. I don't know what it was. And then later on, even Lotta was like, oh wow, it's so interesting how familiar you are with djinns, because djinns sneak in your head and they basically sap the negative energy. Could they basically put you in a coma? Because Sam and Dean cross paths with a djinn. Wasn't one of the episodes where they cross paths with a djinn where it was like using their, like at least for Dean, I want to say, it might have even been Sam, that it was using their dad's voice against them or something like that. That might have been a djinn. That might have been something else. I'm fairly certain the boys like cross paths with a djinn, but I don't remember. It feel like something like, yeah, they would have at some point in time. But either way, the reason why Ada's so familiar with djinns because we find out she has a half djinn son named Tony because she fell in love with a man, Ali. It's a thing of she went into it knowing what he was, but she believed like, no, he's a good person. He would never give into his djinn side. But like little by little he fed and he tried to do good with his powers, but eventually the hunger took over and he went evil and a bunch of hunters hunted him down. And I think that's the interesting and complexity of this supernatural world. Not every supernatural is bad. Like, Dean and Sam had their run-ins with supernaturals that weren't bad people. Sam was always more of, because to be fair, Sam was always kind of the more soft-hearted when it came to that. He was always a little more, don't get it twisted, like Sam had his moments where he wasn't, but he was a little bit more forgiving with certain things than Dean was, especially when it came to the supernatural. Obviously, they made certain exceptions, like Garth, when he became a werewolf and stuff like that. The family he ended up making himself. It's like, yeah, because Garth was a hunter first and then became a werewolf, so on and so forth. But they did have certain situations where they were a little lighter on supernaturals, but like I said, I think that was more so Sam. And I feel like it was almost a little bit of Dean that came out in this instance of like when John was like, yeah, it doesn't matter, son or no son, he's a djinn, he's killing people, we hunt monsters, let's do it. Like, that was such a, like, you can almost, like, Dean, that's a Dean response. And he's like, right, Dean was a lot more like their dad, and Sam was a lot more like their mom, but they did still have those, like, yeah, but Dean still had his sensitivities like his mom, and then Sam also had his straightforwardness and kind of his roughness like his dad, So it's just one of those interesting parallels, because for her, she didn't tell her son what he was. She hoped that, like, hey, there's a good chance my son may never inherit his father's abilities, so why even tell him about it? But at 17, he accidentally dreamed walk, and it basically ended up in her head, and ended up finding out the truth about what happened to her, his father, which she had no control of that. She did not set him up, because for her, it's like she did everything she could to keep the man that she loved, like bring back the man she loved. But, who knows the full context of that story of like, I doubt she told hunters where he was. It's just probably like, right, he was out there doing his thing. Hunters caught on to what he was doing. I don't even know if they knew about him and Ada, like necessarily. It doesn't really matter. And they ended up killing him. So she didn't tell her son what he was. He had to find out on his own, and finding out his father was killed for what he was. And that deep down, his mom was scared of him because she would, and even Ada admits later on, she was so busy trying to protect him from becoming like his father, she never took time to realize, you aren't your dad. You're not the worst parts of your dad, and you're not the worst parts of me. You are you. And, I didn't give you a chance to prove, like, yeah, you are, yeah. Because also, like, yeah, he is made up his moms. He's made up of his everything about his dad and everything about his mom makes up who he is, but he's also his own individual person with his own choices, his own self-control, and she didn't give him that opportunity. That's what's the most frustrating thing for Tony. It's like, you didn't give me a chance. You kind of made that decision on your own not to tell me who I am. I mean, most kids, I mean, even a conversation of you're adopted, that kind of getting thrown at you in later life, you know, that's why I think some parents make the choice of like, I always want you to know, like, you are adopted, like, you deserve the right to know that, and I don't want you to find out later on in life and feel like you're missing a part of yourself or some part of your life was a lie. And for him, it felt like it was, because it's like, not only did you hide this from me, you hid it from me because you were scared. You thought I was going to be some monsters. That's what you see me as, you know? So Ada, given the opportunity, wanted to talk to her son to try and convince him, like, hey, like, I'm sorry, I should have handled things better, you know? And because ultimately they find out he's not actually responsible. It turns out the Akrita themselves are. They're basically infecting people's minds and kind of manipulating them. And I don't know if the end result is it's meant to kill them, or whether it's a situation of we're trying to bend people's wills to what we need, and in the end, like, they die, or whether it's a thing of no, the failed attempts to control people led to people dying, because I think if people resisted too much, it seemed like the end result was always going to be death. It's just if we can bend people's will to what we need it to be, or maybe it's just get rid of the people in your way that could help, the people that have something to do with you getting what you want. If you can remove them from the board, or maybe it's just like, oh no, like trapping them in their trauma and everything gets them to lean the way you want to with everything. So they end up saving, like, the most recent person who was potentially going to be a victim, but Mary in the process got struck. And this is something really interesting that they did with Mary. They dive in. I mean, this show, I think, is really going to dive into trauma. Probably even more so than, like, because, like, Supernatural touched on trauma, but I feel like we didn't get it as much with Dean. We did with Sam, because Sam was always in that complicated space of, like, this is what the family is, and once again, kind of like Mary, his reluctancy for it. Like, there are direct parallels between Mary being told what she is from a young age, and Sam, you know, being dragged into all of this. He didn't want anything, but his dad did. And don't get it twisted that Dean went along with it, but Dean had his own complicated circumstances. Like, he eventually saw that, like, hey, and it was something that people, I think as Dean kind of, you know, struggled with it, but I think other people kind of threw in his face too of, like, right, Dean was always the loyal, quote-unquote, loyal son. He's the one that stuck around when Sam went off to college. And it's like, you got to kind of go live some form of a life. I'm the one that stayed behind. I'm the one that had to deal with Dad. I had to be Dad's perfect little soldier. I always was, you know? So that was always kind of this interesting, different sides of the spectrum that both Sam and Dean were on, both with their own versions of trauma. Stemming from the same thing, but it's just how it manifested and what it represented was kind of different for him, and that's kind of interesting in this regard. So, like, the hunting world, the trauma that was buried in the Winchesters specifically, you don't really get into, like, obviously this is our opportunity to really get into Mary's trauma, and obviously John had so much trauma to begin with just everything with Vietnam. Now you're stacking on the hunting world, everything with his dad. Then you stack in the fact is what happens later on in life. Him and Mary having a family. Like, once again, Dean was like 4, Sam was like 2, I think, when Mary got killed by Yellow Eyes. I always forget Yellow Eyes' name. Is it Azazel, right? I think it might be Azazel. I never can remember it. Like, I will always remember because for the first, like, 2 seasons or whatever, they called him. They eventually gave him a name, but he will always be Yellow Eyes to me because that was obviously the big signature for him. So, because I know there's like a 2-year, there's like a age. Or was it more like? Now, because I think Dean's like 4 years older than Sam. Cause I think he was like 4. Sam was like because I was like, yeah, because Sam was an infant When so I was like, yeah, it was definitely like, yeah, because Dean's like 4 years older than him. So I was like, Dean was like 4, Sam was like a baby. So it's like, they weren't like the happy family for a long time before Mary died, before Yellow Eyes came to do what he did. Which that in itself is actually an interesting thing, because there's this whole conversation about like, hey, like Tony being this half thing, in which they're kind of like, okay, they let that slide because it's Ada's son and he wasn't the bad guy in this instance. We've seen, like, we know in the Hunter world, that doesn't mean jack shit. It's like, oh, you might not have hurt anyone, but I know what you are, your true nature. That's come up from time to time. I'm like, oh, this person's true nature would eventually get the best of them. Like, oh, God. I'm blanking on home dude's name. It's the dude, it's the vampire, was it Benny? The vampire that Dean met in Purgatory. There was a guy that came after, I think, Benny's, was it his, I don't think it was his daughter, I think it was his granddaughter. Like, this guy, like, it was a hunter who was kind of a little not in his head. He was like, oh, I'm gonna prove Benny being what he is. And the hunter guy ended up kind of being more of a monster than Benny was. So Dean had no choice, or Benny had no choice, but they ultimately ended up killing him, right? That ended up being an issue between Sam and Dean. But it's that nature of like, because, like I said, Dean can be on that side of things with certain except Benny was kind of a very, very special exception of just the brotherhood that they formed while they were surviving in Purgatory and everything, right? So it's just interesting to see like how everyone on this squad is so okay with that. But I feel like older John Winchester, having it lost everything he did, seeing what he's seen, probably wouldn't have been receptive. He would have probably been like any other hunter and would just be like, Tony's circumstances, I don't care, kill him. I mean, it's also complicated because the parallel I was also talking about, going to mention just now, it's like, right, let's not forget about Sam. Sam had the whole demon blood thing going on for 5 seasons, you know? Obviously, like, that started and then it crept up and eventually became what, I mean, obviously, like, everything was laying the groundwork to him to being Lucifer's vessel. So, but yeah, for a while, there was the whole demon blood thing and powers and everything. So it's like, yeah, there were people, if I remember correctly, there were people considering hunting Sam because of his circumstances. So it's like, yeah, like, you know, so that's the interesting parallel to it. And that makes it even interesting that, like, once again, that, yeah, because I said that, like, John would probably be the same thing. It's like, I'm forgetting. I brought it up earlier. John is that hunter because he literally said, son or no son, he is what, to be fair, at the time they thought he was a killer, but now that they know that he wasn't, the fact is that he ended up helping save Mary. Yeah. So I went on this whole diatribe, sorry, but I thought it's such an interesting parallel. But getting back to the conversation again about trauma, there's a lot of trauma lately. If you don't, my review will be going up Saturday. My spoiler discussion will probably go up Friday. I just still need to finish editing it. But my spoiler discussion for Black Panther: Wakanda Forever, because I saw it yesterday. So yeah, a lot of back-to-back trauma. But in this regard of like I said, seeing that upbringing in this world, and like, 'cause we got it from Sam's point of view, and now getting it from Mary's point of view, like the first door they went down. Was this doorway of, hey, this is when she killed a werewolf. It was like her family was hunting a family of werewolves. And when she killed the guy, well, he was human. Like, before he died, I thought it was like, oh, he died and then he turned back into a human, which is very traumatic. He transformed back into a human and begged her not to do it, and she did it. And I was like, that is rough. She was a little girl when that happened. It's like, that's a lot. And then the biggest trauma of all for her, I thought could relate it to her cousin, but it's like, she kind of dealt with a lot of that last episode, her and Lata. So, but I thought there would still be something to that. But it's like, no, the real trauma for her is the day when she was 5 years old, her parents told her the truth about everything and saying to not be scared. It's like, that is a lot. Like, I get it. It's like, it's probably what they grew up with. And it's just like, right, we're preparing you for the world you need to learn at a young age. But that is a hard pill to swallow as a little girl, being like, you know, kids at that age are being told, and even she told John, like, yeah, you know how I told you, most parents would be like, you remember when your parents told you those, like, oh, you were scared as a little kid, there were monsters under the bed? It's like, well, my parents told me those monsters were real, and they were out there, and it's up to me to stop them. It's like, that's a lot to put on a kid, because especially for Mary, it's like, I was 5 years old. I was a child. Like, my life could have been whatever I wanted to be, and that was kind of taken from me the moment they told me what I was supposed to be. My life was more so set down this path of, like, there was no turning back. I could never be anything else. Every other door was closed to me, and that's the most frustrating thing, because she wants to leave hunting, but she doesn't know what there is for her, because it's like, most of my life is hunting. Like, what do I know outside of this, And obviously knowing, like, she never fully escapes that world. And I said this before, that, I mean, Sam and Dean got out, but multiple things kept drawing them back in. Yes, it was stuff related to each other, but the hunting world, the supernatural world, never fully lets you go. It will always have some tug on you. Because, I mean, even, like, Sam's kid, son, like, you didn't get much with it in Supernatural, obviously, in the series finale, but the torch kind of passed on to that. But I think his approach was going to be a lot more different than John's approach, just because he had lost Dean, yes, but he wasn't going to let that trauma. He was just going to be like, hey, I'm going to tell you about this world, but he probably didn't want it to fully define it. We don't know. We'll never really have those concrete answers about how Sam approached it, but I'm sure he approached it in contrast to his father, because he had the experience of, like, yes, I know what I felt about going through that, and I would approach it differently. But that might be the sad thing of, you might think you're going to approach it differently, you want to approach it differently, doesn't necessarily mean you actually do approach it differently. It might be this cycle of that trauma just like ended up repeating itself. You hope that's not the case, especially like everything him and his brother, because I'm sure he recognized Dean's trauma in it as well. That, yeah, like, I think you would think he would handle it differently too, but that's the whole point. But I thought that was powerful and heavy, And so it's like, right, in this moment, when your parents say this, John was like, what did you want to hear? And she's like, it's going to be okay. And she's like, you're scared, and that's okay. They told you not to be afraid. It's okay to be afraid, because you can't be brave if you don't know what it's like to be scared, Because fear is a natural part. Because also being afraid keeps you on your toes. Like, it's like, oh, being brave all the time. It's like being scared keeps you aware, keeps you on your toe. Like, if you're brave, you might just think, like, you might go full speed ahead, charging ahead without really thinking, So that is something to consider. But her saying that to her, it's like, right, your life, I will eventually open those doors. Like, it is going to be okay. It might not be okay right now, and it's not going to be, no, it's not okay right now, and it's not going to be okay tomorrow, but someday I will open these doors for you again, and you'll be able to decide who and what you want to be. So I thought that was kind of beautifully done. And just kind of that juxtaposition to, like, how we got to that was Ada apologizing to her son and being like, right, like, you use your power for good, which he goes around trying to help people. He was even trying to help the councilman, and that's why he needed John to be the one to reach out to Mary, because it's like, right, like, how can I, some stranger, help someone through their trauma, the thing that the Akrita is kind of latching onto the most? Like, how am I supposed to help you with that when you don't really know me and I don't really know you? It has to be someone close to you. In this particular case, it was John, because they've got their complicated situation going on, because John cares about Mary, but Mary's kind of keeping her distance. She's even saying, like, right, when she plans on quitting hunting, she's going to leave Lawrence. And he was kind of hoping, like, oh yeah, you could stay at the garage here and work. And he's like, yeah, until you figure things out. But she's like, yeah, I'm probably going to leave Lawrence. And it's like, oh, okay. Because obviously Mary likes him, but she's reluctant. And, John's kind of keeping his guard up too, because, his mom is like, talk to her. Like, if you open up to her, maybe she'll open up to you. And they had this moment where he didn't get opened up to her, but she opened up to him unintentionally. It's like, right, kind of buried her pain and her trauma to him. But given the opportunity at the end of the episode, he's like, yeah, here's this bite for you. I just want to say, you're right, you should probably leave Lawrence. Because I think for him, regardless of how I feel about you, you've been through too much. And I don't want to be the reason that holds you back from living a life you deserve and want to. I think it's a situation of him trying to do the noble thing. It's like, I'm not trying, I want you to be able to live a life, regardless of how I feel about you, because she's having her hesitancy because she's scared, because I think this has kind of been the first time like something like this is happening. Plus, we're kind of from two different worlds. Yes, you're part of the hunting world now, but it hasn't completely defined you your entire life. You went off and lived your life. Yes, you had the traumas associated with joining the army and everything, but you have lived some form of a life outside of all of this. Mary, this is all she's known most of her life. So there's probably also that situation of I don't quite want to. I'm sure maybe even John's interpreting it like, and because I am part of this hunting world, being with me would always kind of connect you back to this world, and you want to have a break from it completely. So I'm sure that kind of plays around. And you could tell that look on Mary's face at the end. She was kind of disappointed because she wanted to have that conversation with John, but I think also his own trauma and his own pain is kind of keeping him from opening him up completely, because he admits to his mom, is like, yeah, like everything I went through in Vietnam, everything with Murph, yeah, it came up during the whole situation last episode, but I'm good. He won't be good until he talks about it with someone, because that trauma isn't going away. And once again, I think that is one of John's biggest flaws, is he is not very open. And I think Mary's kind of in the same regard, like both of them, their trauma keeps them from ever like fully opening up. So that's kind of a sad side of things. But the silver lining to this episode is that Ada and Tony are good, even to the point that she was like, are you okay, baby? And he's like, I'm okay, mama. And now the fact is, because before when he talked to her, he referred to her as Ada, and this time he called her mama. And I was like, that was very sweet. I also like they're setting up the whole him and Lotta thing, but now they also are aware, like, yeah, everything, like, yeah, the Akrita are gathering the essence of rare monsters. So, oh, cool. Every rare monster we've killed up until now, cool. We just actually been doing the Akrita's bidding. Like once again, like, obviously we've known that, but now the characters in the show finally know about that. So. But ultimately, looking through everything, they start piecing together, like, right, they know that the Akrita, like, everything they were doing this episode, the victims they were choosing were people related to trying to get radio towers, because it's like almost like a siren song of like, right, you're trying to control humans. Well, you start with a tower, you're going to send out a mind control signal. Obviously, CW-wise, kind of very similar to what the ISA kind of had planned in season 1 of Stargirl. Yeah, kind of a mind control thing. And obviously they look at all these documents that have signed names on it, and a name keeps popping up, Roxanne. They turn on the radio, and so for her it's just like, once again, who she is, whether she's like a supernatural crew, it has to be that they have to be something supernatural. I don't think there's some regular human, not unless they're witches or something like that. I don't know what to fully make of that, but we're setting up the fact is that they're like, no, everything's going to be fine. Like, essentially, like, they're going to basically, the hits are just going to keep coming. Regardless, like, I don't know if she knows that they're on to Roxanne yet, but, for her, she's not too worried, but those paths are crossing soon. And especially after everything John went through last episode, the whole thing of being like, oh yeah, like, I'm preparing you, you're ready for this war against the Akrita, how that kind of comes into play. And until, like, I think that's going to come into play before he actually gets help with the trauma. Like, I think he will sit down with Carlos and get better, but I think a lot of these wounds he's carrying he will have to carry them forever. But maybe they are closed for a little while until, losing Mary reopens them wide open. Who knows? We'll have to wait and see how everything plays out. Obviously, Ada's going off with Tony for a little while, kind of keeping an eye on him. And, them able to kind of finally get some quality time together. Either way, we'll ultimately have to wait and see where all of this ends up taking us going forward into the next episode. But really, that's all I want to talk about. Till the next time we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day, and goodbye.